Vanakkam. Hello friends. We have been seeing how the society in ancient Tamizhagam went on to take a feudal nature with different categories of chieftains owing allegiance to a king. There were the tribal chieftains and the vassals, the petty chieftains and minor chieftains who went on to become generals, landowning barons, the kirar, the more powerful amidst them the velir, some of whom went on to become ko, that is the king. Eventually, the king, became the absolute owner of the land and he chose to redistribute it in terms of gifts for service rendered to his chieftains as he pleased. Thus, a process of the warlike Maravar and Kalvar clans settling into the Marudam plains, they too became a kirar who were ever ready to go to war at a call from their leader, and they took the peasants to act as soldiers in service. Personal devotion, loyalty and a spirit of sacrifice of the vassals on the one hand and the patronage of the suzerain on the other were the foundations on which this feudal system was built. In due course, the right to rule became hereditary, passing on from father to son. An interesting feature of the Sangam polity in the early stages was the plurality of political centers, with almost every other hilltop having its own chieftain and chieftains also presiding over harbours and trade exchange centres. Struggle for power amidst these chieftains meant that the society and age was one of continuous warfare, an impression reflected exactly in the praise poetry of Sangam literature, where the most celebrated attributes of a king were his capacity to wage war, defeat enemies, plunder cattle and enemy territories, and to punish disobedient chieftains. Apart from cattle raiding, charming maids also formed the target of attack for the chiefs, who camped outside the fortified village walls with their elephants and their horses, causing havoc everywhere. We saw how even the attack of a fortress was codified in the Poruladigaram of Tolgapiyam in the Purathineyiyal as Uringei, Uringei Dane Marudathu Purane. Mulu Mudal Aranam Muttalum Kodalum Anai Neri Marapitrahum Enba goes the Suthiram. This refers to the enemies who lay siege to the fortress on the outside and the or the chieftains who are trying to protect it from inside. It would appear that marriage by capture was a regular practice in ancient Tamil society, going by the number of poems that refer to kings or chieftains who go to wage war with a village, wherein they ask for the hand of a fair maiden in marriage that is refused by a father or a brother of the maid. They show how the chieftains with their armies of elephants and horses lay siege to the village with the intent of stealing away the girl, and how the village lies in ruins because of the ensuing warfare. Now this led the poets to curse the beauty of the girl, but not so much the cruelty or the callous attitude of the war chief. In Purananuru poem 354 sung by Paranar, which comes under the Thinai Kanji, where an enemy wages war and the leader wearing the Kanji Poo is trying to protect his fortress, there is a subdivision, a Thurai, known as Mahatpar Kanji. This subdivision denotes a chief demanding the hand of a girl met with resistance. So common was the practice that it was codified as a subdivision, and the poem goes, Araisu Talaivarinum Adangallana Niregal Yekkam Neerin Mulha Purayor Sernana Tandayum Perkum starts the poem. The girl's father does not fear the king. Here he is together with his people getting ready to face the king in battle, and he is washing and readying his spear. Oh, the beauty of this doe-eyed girl is going to bring destruction to this village, laments the poet. So with the beautiful maidens of the village under constant threat, not just their cattle, Sangam poems reveal a very interesting feature where these maidens reared bulls which were trained to fight strangers. The heroine trained her pet bull to be ferocious and to kill. Now something which is against the nature of these gentle beasts of burden. Kolletu kodu anjuvane marumayum pullale ayamahal goes a very famous line from Mullai Kali of Kalitogai by Solan Nallur Thiranar, which shows how the maiden looked down upon any suitor who couldn't tame her ferocious bull. Could this practice have been brought about to help the bull protect itself against cattle raiders, and not just as a means of a vain sport called Yeru Tazhuvudal, which we know popularly by the name Jallikattu today? This interesting viewpoint is given by Dr. Padmavati, a senior epigraphist with the Tamil Nadu Archaeological Department. She also offers a very interesting perspective on the cockfight, that is the Sevar Chandai, which is a very ancient Tamil sport that is banned today, but still clandestinely happening in the village sides, where you can see the villagers rearing these special rooster breeds with great passion and care. Dr. Padmavati points out, if you look at the movements of the leg and the claws of two roosters in fight, they resemble the leg movement of martial arts such as Silambam and Kalariyapayattu. Could these movements have been learned from the cock? Could be, given the fact that there is a hero stone raised for a dead cock, and the Chola capital of Urayur was originally known as Kozhiyur. With the power-hungry kings looking to expand their territories continuously, how did they motivate the warrior chieftains as well as the peasant folk into fighting? By propagating a fierce cult of war that placed great emphasis on the courage and valor of the warrior, and how dying a soldier's death ensured a place in the heavens, not just any heaven but Veerasorgam, the martyr's heaven, and eventually the dead hero goes on to become a hero stone and is deified and worshipped by the villagers for posterity. While the poet played endlessly on the warrior's hopes regarding the prospects of plundered wealth, the patron's gift of land, and the pleasant sensations of hero's paradise, quite a few poems reveal the voluntary and cheerful sacrifices of mothers and wives. So much so that a Thurai, a subdivision of the Vahaitine that stands for victory, goes by the name Mudin Mullai. Now this was dedicated to glorify the feisty spirit of the women of ancient warrior clans. And one of the most famous poems is the Purananuru poem 279 by the lady poet Okkur Masatiyar, that sings the praise of an unnamed heroic mother, capturing the spirit that prevailed in Sangam society. Keduga Sinde Kadida Ival Tunive, Mudin Mahalir Adal Tahume. மேலாள் உற்ற சிறுவிற்கு இவள் தன்னை யானை எரிந்து களத்தொழிந்தனனே goes the song, where Tanne refers to her father. We will look at the English version. May her will be broken, for her courage is cruel. She is from an ancient warrior clan, and so this is fitting. Her father killed an elephant and fell in the battlefield the day before yesterday. Her husband was killed in war yesterday, while he was trying to defend the enemies who had come to indulge in cattle raid. Today, hearing the call of the war drum, she is overcome with desire, and having no one left but her young son, she calls him, puts oil in his hair, and gives a spear in his hand, and bids him to march towards the battlefield. Oh, her courage is cruel. While such praise poetry glorified war and martyrdom, the background or the setting revealed a seemingly callous attitude towards the suffering of the common people on account of these continuing warfares. Wars were fought not just for annexing territories but also for plunder and revenge. A much advertised part of the expedition was ruining the harvest fields and well-tended gardens by setting elephants to march into the fields and even setting fire to the peasant settlements. These were all recorded as acts of bravery, as one can see in Purananuru's song 16, sung by the poet Pandarangannanar in praise of a Chola king, Rajasuyam Veta Perinar Killi. The song comes under the Vanjitine, which refers to a king in need of more territories, wearing the Vanji flower and going to wage war with an enemy king. And here the Thurai, the subdivision, is known as Malapula Vanji, which actually refers to actions such as marauding and setting fire to enemy territory. Vinay Maatchiya Virai Puraviyodu Malai Uruvin Tol Parapi starts the poem. With your great horses, O king, you are going to war, and the sight of the innumerable soldiers with their shields looks as if clouds of grey have descended on the enemy's territory. You have captured the enemy's paddy fields. You have set the peasants' houses on fire, which are burning from the very wood that was used to build them. Their drinking water that was protected from their own people and animals have now been destroyed by your elephants that have entered the waters and made them muddy and useless. The village on fire resembles the burning rays of the midday sun. With a sword that smells of flesh and the sandalwood paste on your chest, you look like the terrible war god Murugan, goes the poet. Well, an important part of the ruling class's ideology thrived on the subjugation of the peasantry, extracting surplus from the Marudam lands and using it to pay tribute to fund the wars. The wealth and status of a king depended on the surplus that he collected from the Velalar, and of course the Velalar were duly acknowledged as benefactors of the world and as supporters of the burden of the state. This makes us look at even the verses of Thiruvalluvar, who sang Uludundu Vaalvare Vaalvar Mattellam Toludundu Pin Selbavar. Only he lives who lives by the plough, the others merely follow him. In a fresh perspective, was the thirst for immortal fame the driving motive behind the war exploits and the munificence of the chieftains? History shows how eventually the kings became equated with divinity in almost all the cultures around the world, some cultures having their priest king. Remember, in a previous episode, we saw how the term Iraivan that was initially used to denote a king later on became a term used to denote God. Again, if we think of Valluvar's dictum, Thondrir Puhalodu Thondruga, Agdilar Thondalin Thondramai Nandru, if you're born in this world, be born to achieve fame. If not, better not to be born at all. That seems quite an extreme view that one finds better suited to these warrior heroes. In Tamil country, warrior heroes and chieftains were accorded divine status. How? People erected hero stones in their memory and worshipped them as protective deities, an integral part of early Tamil religion, the continuity of which is found today in the form of the worship of traditional deities such as Madasami and Karupasami. In a Purananuru poem 329, again coming under the Vahai Tinai, under the subdivision of Mudin Mullai, sung by Madurai Aruvai Vanigan Ilavetanaar, where the term Aruvai meant a piece of cloth, a dress, and probably this Ilavetanaar was a clothes trader, and he belonged to Madurai, and so his name Madurai Aruvai Vanigan Ilavetanaar. This poem speaks of how the poet visits a small village which has very few people living in it, and in the early morning the clansmen are preparing toddy at home to take to the hero stone which is just outside their settlement. The hero stone is bathed in water and people light oil lamps, and the fragrance of this fills the morning air. People offer toddy and other things in a traditional padayal, an offering, to this hero stone and worship it. And this village is guarded by a warrior chieftain so ferocious that enemies dare come near it as they would not approach a serpent's abode, goes the poem. Illadu kallin silkudi seerur pudainadu kallin naatpali utti nannir aatti நெய் நரை கொளைய மங்குல் மாப்புகை மருகுடன் கமழும் அருமனை இருக்கைத்து ஆயினும் வரிமிடற்று, goes the poem, which ends with the line இரவலர்க்கு அருகாது ஈயும் வன்மை உரை சொல் நெடுந்தகை ஓம்பும் ஊரே. This chieftain is generous to all the supplicants who seek refuge in this village. Another very important Puram poem by Mangudi Kirar describes a remote village settlement. Though available only fragmentarily, it starts with the words Adalarun Tuppin Kurunde Mullai என்று இன்னான்கல்லது பூவும் இல்லை கருங்கால் வரகே இருங்கதிர் திணையே சிறுகொடி கொள்ளே பொறி கிழர் அவரையோடு இன்னான்கல்லது உணவும் இல்லை. The poet says there are only 4 kinds of flowers, Kurunji, Mullai, Marudam and Neidal, and there are only 4 kinds of food that are to be had in this village: the varahu, tinai, kollu and avarai. Kollu being the horse gram, the rest being millets. And we saw in an episode on Neolithic Marudam of how avarai, the pigeon pea, was one of the earliest cultivated plant that archaeobotany traces to 2000 BCE. So this was a very old settlement, obviously in a forest region as the soil was not fit for agriculture, and here lived four ancient clans, the Tudiyar, Parayar, Panar and Kadambar. And though there were four kinds of food, four kinds of flowers and four clans living there, they all worshipped only one god, and that was the warrior chieftain who died killing the enemy's elephants and protecting the village. This poem led to all kind of speculation regarding the pre-caste Tamil society and advent of caste, but the meaning has to be understood against the socio-political and economic background, points out the noted historian M.G.S. Narayanan of the University of Calicut. He says that it simply denotes a warrior settlement, which was a special kind of settlement as opposed to a settlement of the Velir or the Ulavar. And here only the Kadambar, who were the warriors, lived along with the Tudiyar and Parayar, the drummers who were an integral part of the army, as well as the Panars, the nomadic bards who accompanied them to the battlefield. M.G.S. Narayanan, in a series of essays, portrays how the Panars were accredited spokespersons of society and keepers of their traditional value and conscience. These wandering bards depended on the charity of the villagers, and every village had a mandram or a poduvil in the middle of the village under an old banyan tree which had its sacred spot, which probably had a shrine for an ancestral deity or a guardian deity. And this was a place of congregation of the village elders who came for consultations, for the youth who came to play games or to gamble, and for the bards and their families who were in search of a resting place. The mandram was the social center of the village, and sadly it became a target during warfare. The elders appear to have lost their authority due to an increasing helplessness in the face of these constant wars. The youth had to go away to wage the war along with their chieftains, and hence the mandram wore a deserted look. The traditional bards who retained their nomadic habits lingered on as representatives of a bygone era of egalitarian values and clannish loyalty. They increasingly felt the pinch of poverty as warfare increased. Many a poem captures the pitiable plight of the bards who wandered from place to place with their families. They didn't fit into the new social order of agriculturists. They knew how to sing and dance, but they did not produce. So they were destined to starve. The group of Aatrupadai songs in the Pattu such as the Porunar Aatrupadai, Koothar Aatrupadai, Sirban Aatrupadai and Perumban Aatrupadai were composed for the guidance of the Panar, and they were asked to seek the courts of the chiefs or kings who were generous patrons. Thus, the traditional folk singers were now transformed into court singers. They accompanied their patrons into the field of battle. They employed their traditional skills to encourage the chiefs to fight and comforted them when they were wounded in battle. In every way, they legitimized the power of the chieftain, maintained his lineage, and raised him to glory and fame. In return, the chieftain gave them food, clothing, gold jewelry, and at times even land, as we saw earlier. Soon these traditional bards were replaced by a new breed of poets known by the term Andanar or Sandror, Brahmin priests from the north. To understand how and why they migrated in large numbers into Tamil country and how they became a major influential factor in the court of the king in ancient Tamil country, even during the Sangam times, the Puram 16 song that we just saw speaks of the Chola king Rajasuyam Veta Perinar Killi, where Rajasuya is the great sacrificial yagna, a practice hitherto not found in ancient Tamil country but introduced by the incoming Vedic priests. They also influenced the very language and literature. And to understand this, we will take a detour into the history of their migration from up north in the next episode. Vanakkam.